Good afternoon, and welcome to another short introduction to a few topics in my classes, wherever you're taking them, actually. I think this will apply pretty broadly. The topic I want to cover today is the impact of war upon societies. Particularly, these thoughts began with the United States in the Second World War for, say, a American history survey. But, the same kind of ideas can be applied to World War II anywhere or to any major military conflict since the French Revolution in 1789. And why do I locate that in 1789? Well, with the American, but especially the French Revolution, you have a combination of two things. You have, one, a massive expansion of what it means for someone to be a citizen, the idea that non-property owners can be full citizens and exercise certain rights and responsibilities on the one hand, and on the other hand, the physical capacity, thanks to the early and eventually the entire Industrial Revolution, of nation states to put large amounts of soldiers onto the battlefield to communicate with them effectively and to keep accurate records of them. And so any major conflict we cover in most of the classes that I teach that aren't, say, World Civ before 1500 will fall into this category. And the impacts beyond the battlefield are important. So in particular, I want to discuss briefly what happens to families when soldiers leave. So what generally happens is when soldiers leave for war in the numbers you're talking about after 1800, the workforce of any local community that's heavily impacted is going to be, be set by a need to replace adult male workers with traditionally non-workers. And before 1945, before World War II, this means that women, to a lesser extent children, ethnic and religious minorities, depending on what country you're in, who had not been seen as suitable for service or industrial employment, suddenly are in the workplace. And in some cases, this creates dramatic social change. The United States with race and gender, most European countries with women in the workplace, or various ethnic minorities, religious minorities. Then there's a similar story in China and India and the Ottoman Empire. Some of these will spur local nationalist movements. Colonized peoples will experience this, with the war calling people into vocations and into jobs where, say, colonizing countries had excluded them in order to prevent them from gaining skills and income. And so war has this dramatic impact, not simply in terms of loss of life, but in terms of fostering social change at home. And we only have so much information, certainly more in the last 50 or 60 years, on how families were impacted. We certainly know that women and children were more likely to become heads of household, but also the disconnect between, say, adult male heads of household and their children will definitely increase. And there's been a lot done by militaries around the world to avoid this. Some of that has to do with the propaganda emphasis on the service of the male head of household, and you see this in all countries in World War I and World War II. Some of this with an importance placed on communication. This is good for morale for the soldiers as well. And so countries have acknowledged this really since the beginning, because before the French Revolution, including in the American Revolution, and to some extent during the American Civil War and the European wars of the 1800s, you saw soldiers go home during the harvest time to see their family, to bring in food, take care of people who weren't being taken care of by the state prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so rates of desertion, people actually leaving the military prior to World War I in 1914, can go as high as 20%, and were expected to be similarly high during World War I. But they weren't, because of better infrastructure, communication, and the ideals of nationalism. It wasn't just the citizenship and the rights revolution of the middle class in the 1700s. Americans, Confederates, French, what have you, they deserted in large numbers. They went home for the seasons, for the harvest, out of need, out of a sense that people without a lot of property weren't really, at heart being taken care of as citizens of the nation, that they weren't fighting for the same things that the wealthy were. And that the perception of that, and in some cases the reality of that, changes by World War I and World War II. So if you look at the way that, say, American involvement in World War II impacts families and the industrial workforce in the U.S., that's the story we're getting into here. Modern warfare, the total commitment of nation states to fighting each other, plays out in households and in workplaces, in small towns and in the big cities of the Industrial Revolution. Thank you. I'll see you next time.